Okay, negotiating with the devil. This deep dive has intense written all over it. It's
Yeah.
not every day you pick up a book that
Okay.
grapples with the ethics of peacemaking, you know?
It's certainly not your average beach read.
Yeah.
Pierre Hazan takes us beyond just the mechanics of diplomacy
All right.
and into those morally murky waters
Yeah.
where the right choice isn't always clear.
Exactly. And you
Yeah.
clearly gravitate toward those tough questions.
Um,
Choosing this book for our deep dive tells me you're not one to shy away from the gray areas.
Absolutely. And Hazan doesn't let us off easy.
Right.
He dives right into the deep end,
Okay.
starting with the International Committee of the Red Cross back in 1942.
Oh, wow.
Imagine being faced with this dilemma. The Holocaust is unfolding.
Right.
The world is at war.
Yeah.
And you're the ICRC.
Mm-hmm.
Do you speak out,
Yeah.
knowing it could jeopardize your entire humanitarian mission?
That's the thing that gets me the weight of that decision.
Oh.
It's 1942. You're seeing the horrors of the Holocaust unfold.
Right.
But speaking out against Germany could mean losing access to prisoners of war.
Right.
Shutting down relief efforts.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to weigh those stakes?
It's a stark example of how real-world constraints can complicate moral imperatives.
Right.
Hazan emphasizes that the ICRC was bound by Swiss neutrality.
Okay.
So there was a very real fear of retaliation.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, their ability to operate hinged on maintaining some level of trust,
Yeah.
even with a regime as brutal as Nazi Germany.
So it's almost like they're caught between two versions of doing the right thing.
Right.
Stay silent, keep channels open, maybe save some lives that way.
Yeah.
But then, isn't there a moral obligation to speak out against such atrocities,
Yeah.
even if it comes at a cost?
Yeah.
Didn't the ICRC's silence, however unintentional, end up emboldening the perpetrators?
And that's precisely the question Hazan grapples with.
Right.
He highlights how the ICRC's internal vote on whether to condemn the Holocaust was actually split.
Wow.
Members in Geneva, immersed in the humanitarian crisis, mostly voted to condemn.
Interesting.
But those stationed elsewhere, perhaps more attuned to the geopolitical chess game, were largely against it.
oh, wow.
It reveals these competing priorities that exist even within organizations dedicated to humanitarian principles.
It's fascinating how something like geographical distance could influence such a weighty moral decision.
Yeah.
It's a sobering thought how easily our convictions can be swayed by external factors.
Right.
And this idea that there are no easy answers,
Mhm.
that sometimes even inaction has profound consequences.
Yeah.
It really resonates throughout the book, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this takes us to another pivotal point in Hazan's analysis.
Okay.
The shift in thinking brought about by the war on terror,
Right.
particularly the Bush-era's stance on negotiation.
Okay.
Here, the lines between good and evil were drawn sharply, leaving little room for the kind of nuanced diplomacy Hazan advocates.
Yeah, it was very much a you're either with us or against us mentality. But didn't that hardline approach, this refusal to engage with those deemed terrorists,
Yeah.
create a whole new set of ethical dilemmas? I mean,
Yeah.
who gets to define who's a terrorist?
Yes.
And what happens when those labels prevent any possibility of dialogue?
It's a slippery slope,
Right.
and one that Hazan illustrates with the example of Hamas.
Okay.
Now, Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by many countries,
Right.
but they were also democratically elected in Gaza.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two realities?
Yeah.
Do you engage with them as legitimate political actors?
Right.
Or do you isolate them, potentially exacerbating the very conditions that lead to violence?
It reminds me of that quote often attributed to Churchill, if you're going through hell, keep going.
Right.
Meaning sometimes the only way out of a bad situation is to push through the tough parts.
Yeah.
Even if it means having uncomfortable conversations.
Exactly.
Right.
Hazan pushes back against simplistic narratives and easy answers.
Yeah.
He forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths,
Right.
urging us to think critically about the labels we use
Mhm.
and the potential consequences of refusing to engage with those we deem the enemy.
Right.
And this idea of simplistic narratives leading us astray, it really comes to a head in Hazan's analysis of the Bosnian War.
Right.
Here you have the UN, this bastion of international cooperation, stepping in to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah.
But as Hazan argues, their strict adherence to neutrality, their reluctance to intervene militarily, ultimately made them complicit in the very atrocities they were trying to stop.
You're right, the Bosnia section was a tough read.
Yeah.
It's one thing to talk about the limits of neutrality in the abstract.
Right.
But when Hazan describes the siege of Sarajevo, the desperate pleas for help from civilians trapped in Srebrenica,
Yeah.
it becomes horrifyingly real.
And Hazan lays the blame squarely at the feet of the international community,
Right.
particularly the UN Security Council.
Okay.
They issued resolution after resolution demanding an end to the violence, establishing so-called safe areas. But when it came to enforcing those resolutions, to putting boots on the ground and risking peacekeepers' lives,
Yeah.
the political will simply wasn't there.
So they were basically playing a high-stakes game of pretend.
Right.
They had the best intentions, I'm sure, but their inaction, their unwillingness to deviate from this strict adherence to neutrality,
Yeah.
had devastating consequences.
And this gets to the heart of Hazan's argument about Bosnia.
Okay.
He says that sometimes the most ethical course of action isn't clinging to some idealized notion of neutrality.
Right.
Sometimes it's acknowledging that one side is the aggressor,
Yeah.
that atrocities are happening, and that intervention, even imperfect, messy intervention,
Right.
is the only way to stop the bloodshed.
It's like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
And this is where Hazan's own experience as a mediator really shines through, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
He's not just some detached observer. He was there on the ground, witnessing the horrors firsthand.
Yeah. He recounts this meeting with a Bosnian Serb official who was holding prisoners hostage.
Right.
This official nonchalantly tells Hazan that he'll release some, but only the ones he deems worthless.
Oh my gosh.
Hazan is floored by the callousness, the utter disregard for human life.
Right.
But he's also forced to confront this impossible question. Do you negotiate with someone like that?
Right.
Do you compromise your principles to save even a few lives,
Yeah.
knowing that it might mean playing into the hands of a war criminal?
It's agonizing.
Yeah.
And it makes you question your own values, your own sense of right and wrong.
Right.
If you were in Hazan's shoes, how could you possibly decide what to do? It feels like a no-win situation.
And it's a dilemma that repeats itself throughout history.
Yeah.
Hazan argues that we saw echoes of it in the Syrian conflict as well,
Right.
particularly with the use of evacuations as a tactic.
Right. The evacuations.
Yeah.
On the surface, it seems like a humanitarian no-brainer getting civilians out of harm's way. But as Hazan points out, it wasn't that simple, was it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
While evacuations did save lives,
Right.
they also played into the hands of the Assad regime
Right.
by emptying out rebel-held areas, by just placing entire populations.
Yeah.
Assad was able to consolidate his power to essentially cleanse these areas of opposition.
Right.
So the mediators were caught in this moral quagmire.
Yeah.
Alleviate immediate suffering or risk enabling a dictator's long-term strategy of control.
It reminds me of that line from the book from an anonymous mediator who says, "Some rights can be deferred, the right to life cannot."
Right.
It's such a chilling statement, but it speaks to the impossible choices these mediators faced.
Yeah.
How do you weigh the right to life against the risk of further empowering a brutal regime?
Right.
Where do you even begin to draw the line? It's almost like that question becomes the central thread of the whole book, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When do we compromise? When do we stand firm? And how do we live with the consequences either way? It feels especially relevant when Hazan talks about what he calls the end of Pax Americana. Like the old rules of global power are changing right before our eyes.
It's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Hazan argues that the era of the U.S. being the sole superpower dictating the terms of peace is fading.
Okay.
We're entering a multipolar world with new players, new alliances, and new sets of interests.
Right.
And that has profound implications for how we approach conflict resolution.
So what does that look like in practice?
Yeah.
It feels like things could either get really messy.
Right.
Or maybe this opens up space for new approaches, new voices at the table.
Hazan points to the grain deal brokered during the Russia-Ukraine war as a perfect example.
Okay.
Here you have a deal happening between two warring nations,
Right.
facilitated by countries with their own agendas, and it actually works, at least for a while.
Right.
Shows that in this multipolar world, traditional alliances become less relevant.
Yeah.
Successful mediation might require engaging with actors we might not be comfortable with.
Right.
Actors who might not share our values, but who hold the keys to de-escalation.
It's like that old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
But maybe with a less adversarial spin.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more like, hey, we might disagree on a whole lot of things, but let's find that tiny sliver of common ground and build from there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that Hazan sees a glimmer of hope in some of the more localized approaches to peacemaking,
Okay.
particularly in the Sahel region of Africa.
Right.
He talks about local communities in the Sahel engaging directly with groups labeled as terrorists
Right.
by Western governments, negotiating ceasefires and finding ways to coexist.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So it's like bypassing the top-down international intervention model and saying, we know the local dynamics, we understand the grievances, let us try to work things out.
Right.
It's empowering in a way, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like you don't have to be a high-powered diplomat to engage in peacemaking.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Hazan argues that we've often overlooked the agency of those closest to the conflict.
Right.
He challenges us to think about peace building, not as something imposed from above, but as a process that must be owned and driven by the people directly affected by the conflict.
Okay, so after this deep dive into negotiating with the devil, or where do we land, it feels like Hazan throws out the rule book and gives us a whole lot to think about, but not necessarily a clear set of answers.
That's the beauty of it.
Right.
Hazan doesn't hand us a neat checklist or a 10-point plan for peace.
Right.
Instead, he equips us with something far more valuable.
Okay.
The ability to think critically about conflict, to question our assumptions,
Yeah.
and to embrace the uncomfortable complexities of peacemaking in a world that's constantly shifting.
And he reminds us with that very chilling quote from Gramsci that the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters.
Right.
Makes you wonder, in this messy, multipolar world, are we the monsters or are we the ones fighting against them?
It's a question worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
Yeah, it's been good.
It's been intense, challenging, and thought-provoking in all the best ways.
Absolutely.
And to you, dear listener, we hope this conversation inspires you to grapple with these questions in your own life.
Right.
Because in a world where the lines between right and wrong are often blurry, the most important thing we can do is to keep asking the hard questions.
Yeah.